I don't want to confuse the end of an ecologically unsustainable, untenable way of civilization working in this moment with a complete guarantee of extinction. There is a future. It may look very different. And sometimes I think the inability to see exactly what that future is or plan for it can be confused for there not being one. And I'm sort of okay with that uncertainty. And in the meantime, all one can really do is the work to try and make that, whatever it ends up being, more positive and be more. There's a sense of biophilia about it and decentering of the human.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Ian Garrett, who is both a colleague and a friend who I've known for a number of years. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you for having me, Claude.
It's really great because you wear so many different hats. You're a prof at York. You'll introduce yourself, but I'm very happy to have you here because you can come at the issue of art and climate change from so many different points of view, as an academic, as a practitioner, as a researcher, and so on and so forth. So why don't you start just by giving us a short introduction to who you are and what you do, and then we'll jump into reality.
Sure. It's always a choice of what order I introduce things in. So I'll start in this as I'm co-founder and director of the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts, formerly ER, now RE Center, as we've moved it up to Canada. But we founded it in Los Angeles in 2008. Myself and Miranda Wright, my co-founder. How I ended up here is, as you mentioned, I'm a associate professor of ecological design for performance at York University, where I teach design and sustainability as it intersects with arts and culture from a few different lenses, including ecoscenography as a design practice within the performing arts. And I'm a practicing designer and artist. My background is primarily in the performing arts around lighting, media, and other forms of scenography, dabbling into scenic as well. But over the last few years, a lot of that has veered towards a hybrid practice around mixed reality and live performance, which actually relates back to, and maybe we'll get into why in this or a future conversation, that relates back to it, or actually has origins in creating an ecological practice as a designer and performance maker.
Well, it's interesting that the digital aspect, and we will get to that. But I want to start the way I've started with all the other conversations this season, which is around the notion of reality and accepting reality. And I think you've listened to episode 19. Mm-hmm. What came to mind when you listened to it? There's a lot there in terms of content, but around the notion of reality and your perception and work around that idea. Historian Yuval Harari. If you think about any religion, any economic system, any political system, at the basis you will find some fictional story about God, about money, about human rights, about a nation. All of these things are fictional stories. They are not a biological reality. But it's a very powerful and convincing and benign fiction that helps us organize our political and legal systems in the modern world.
Well, there's a few different thoughts that came to mind, and I've had the actually opportunity to spend a bit of time with it. My most common way of consuming media these days is through audio and podcasts. So I had the opportunity to listen to it a couple of different times. There's a couple of ideas that resonate with me. There's one that I think that you've heard me refer back to a bit, and you've come back to it in a couple of different conversations as well, that comes out of Yuval Harari's work around the idea of fictions, or I usually frame it as performances. And so that this idea that everything, our civilizations are made up, and we have a choice for the systems in which we operate, and that the duality between our connection to or disconnection from nature, or our attempt to feel like we exist outside of the environment in which we live, is performative. And so I come back to that idea a lot. One of the things that also, and I appreciate about the way that you composed it together, was by combining it with the field recordings as well. So that combining both the way that we think and talk about this topic, but then also continually coming back to something that is, although it's mediated, is itself a sense of reality, is not necessarily a processed thought, is not a quotation in there, and sort of like quoting the world performing itself, I think, is an interesting thing one of the reasons that I think that it has some good, that it's good for re-listening as well. Um, and then I keep coming back to the idea of grief, which I know that is the idea there, but I don't know if it's because I have lived my entire life with an ecological question around it. And I don't even mean that philosophically. I just mean my entire life has been sort of framed by questions of ecological change, at least as background information. Or that having now worked within this realm of the intersection of arts and culture and ecology, or just in sustainability in general, since throughout my adult life, has I don't know, when I think about um, the grief, there's definitely like a soul nostalgia, an idea of missing something and watching the world change, but I feel like I've also had the opportunity to at least operate. I wouldn't say that I've moved beyond grief, but rooted in that grief, that it feels active, and thoughtful as to what is possible. Um, there's a conversation I had recently with the dean of the School of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York, ostensibly my boss, where just in terms of change and that programmatically, independent of that, the idea of letting go versus eliminating. And so I think a lot in terms of grief, and our change ecologically about what we're willing to let go versus what is going to be stripped from us or taken back.
Well, in terms of environment, we don't have that much control, and that's part of the problem. Is that the
Mm-hmm.
problems are so huge that we feel powerless, and yet, as you say, there are actions, concrete actions within our communities, within our control, and as artists, I think we have more power than we think
Mm-hmm.
over ideas, concepts, points of view. Those can be very empowering to the individual and as a cultural worker to influence directions. So maybe we could talk a bit about the work. Now, you choose whichever direction you want. I know
Mm-hmm.
you've been committed to this kind of work around art and ecology for many years. So maybe talk about some of the projects that you have done and where they're coming from, just to give examples of the kind of work that you've been involved in.
Well, I mentioned in the introduction that a lot of the work has shifted towards this hybrid practice around the digital and mixed reality. So, looking at aspects of virtual and augmented and things in between, plus reality, and how that connects to performance. And no, that's actually rooted in my mind, at least with an ecological practice. The origins of that came from as someone who enjoys the outdoors and also enjoys technology. One of my last remaining hobbies, I'm really good at ruining my hobbies by integrating them into my professional life, was around geocaching, which for those who are unfamiliar, is using $1 billion satellite system to find Tupperware in the woods. Um, But what fascinates me about it, or why I'm so attracted to it, is that it is like unmooring from time the sharing of space. That it, like, when somebody sets forward a cache, the intention is for somebody else to find it, and so there is a reason. And I'm always sort of and like, why did somebody want me to come here? And my favorite ones are ones where it's like it's even if it's not obvious exactly what they wanted to see, but you can tell why someone would appreciate a place or not. So in 2010, 2011, about 10 years ago, I was having a conversation, and have already sort of working this sphere, but I was having a conversation with Cassie Mador, who's the artistic director of the Dance Exchange, formerly the Liz Lerman Dance Exchange. And their first large project was a project called 500 Miles, 500 Stories, in which she was going to walk with members of the company from her apartment in the Washington, D.C. area, and trace back the lineage of the power she consumed to the coal mines in West Virginia that provided that. And part of that conversation was, as they were walking, they'd be creating performance along the way. Many times they'd be stopping to work with communities that were impacted by this transmission, or were just sort of in the path of moving from this city, you know, and everything that was loaded within it being that specific city, to this natural resource. But sometimes they weren't. And so we were having a conversation about how that experience might be shared by somebody else. So a lot of the direction that's gone in sort of exploring this combination of geolocation and different ways of performance capture, essentially, is about trying to take especially movement-based work in which somebody is interacting with the environment and creating a asynchronous experience with for an audience member, because these are relatively inaccessible places, or might be accidentally found, or that there's an intentionality towards how you might contrast the experience of a place in two different times, extending all the way through to an idea of climate change. There's some collaborations that we're developing, or have been attempting to develop for a while now, of working within threatened landscapes, particularly in like Pacific low-lying nations that will vanish with the rising seas, and looking at how to collaborate with artists that are connected to these places to essentially archive performance that is intrinsically tied to the land, that in the future may only be able to be found through geocoordinates or mapping to indicate that those once existed. And then how can you collapse the time of those two spaces? So a lot of the projects that we work with through Toaster Lab, the sort of collective that creates those projects, is around this combination of playing with time and space and trying to collapse those in interesting ways through technology to talk about how place changes, and to sort of to bring us to a more ecological timeline. I think it's come up in previous episodes around like how long trees take, that they work on different time scales than we do.
Cultural theorist Thomas Berry. Our challenge is to create a new language, even a new sense of what it is to be human. It is to transcend not only national limitations, but even our species' isolation, to enter into the larger community of living species. This brings about a completely new sense of reality and value. Yeah, and I think one of the things I admire with you is that you're an eco-responsible producer in terms of measuring the impact of, say, the electricity or the tools, and you've worked on that in different ways. But could you talk more about that? Because that's a bit elusive for the common user. Like, I'm using technology now, I'm drawing electricity. I have no real idea of how much energy I'm using and whether I even think it's worthwhile in terms of the footprint. But you've done a lot of thought about that. So could you talk a bit more about that kind of measurement work?
So I'm originally trained as an architect. That's how I started my university career. And at the time that I was studying architecture was at the tail end of the development of the LEED measurement protocols. And so it was intrinsic to the way that that field of design was being taught at that time. It still is, but it was early in there. You couldn't really walk down the hall without having a conversation related to it in some way or those questions rising. I ended up not ever practicing architecture and going towards a performance design career, and spent a lot of time sort of considering. I would spend time in our like holds while we were in technical rehearsals trying to calculate like how much power am I actually using, especially because I was primarily working as a lighting designer, and considering how different forms of power would impact the land that it was related to. Like if you wanted to switch something over to solar or another renewable resource, I was in Los Angeles at the time, so solar was sort of the obvious choice. Was how big was this area that you need? Is this theater that I'm in large enough footprint to be able to become neutral in its consumption of energy resources, things like that. And that's led to now a couple of decades of inquiry into what are the actual impacts of the practices that we have, and also when do we choose for that to influence how we make and what we make. Because one of the things that's unique about working within the arts versus working within architecture is that you can have a building that you've designed and created, which is the core concept of it is the integration of sustainable practices into it. And hypothetically, you could in the arts as well, but oftentimes we're looking towards a different outcome. And unless we're explicitly creating ecological art or making an ecological performance, then those aspects of it, of how we make things, might not be obvious, and we may or may not want them to be obvious. Additionally, their ability to have an impact on the viewer, whoever is coming into contact with that work, the ability to influence the way that they see the world or change that, can be entirely separate from the way that it's made. The sort of extreme thought experiment that I like to use in a performance context is if you had a play in which the audience left with their minds changed about all of their activities. You could say that that was positive, but if the set that took place on was a pile of burning tires, which is an objectively bad thing to do for the environment, there is a conversation by framing it as an arts practice as to, is there value in having that impact because of the greater impact. And those sort of complexities have sort of defined the fusion and different approaches in which to take, that it's not just around metrics. What that's led to more recently is efforts to try and create tools for artists to understand their environmental impacts. We have a long-term relationship with Julie's Bicycle. We've been trying to work with their tools and bringing them into various contexts. Right now, we're supported to be able to convert those into a Canadian context so that they work within the way, or work better within the way that culture works within this country, and our power and resource makeup. But they'll be the first to acknowledge that it's not necessarily a tool for the intent of it is not like LEED, in which you are getting certified because you have come up with a precise carbon footprint. It's a tool for essentially decision making in that artistic context, that if you know this information, then you have a better way to consider critically the way that you are making and what you're making, and how you are representing your values in those aspects, regardless of whether or not it is explicitly part of the work as well. And so there's lots of tools in which I've had the opportunity to have a relationship with, which are really about empowering artists, arts makers, arts collectives to be able to make those decisions so that their individual values towards sustainability regardless of what they're actually making, can also be represented, and that they can make choices that best represent those, regardless of whether or not they're explicitly creating something for Earth Day.
Well, some artists do that intuitively. They're
Mm-hmm.
aware of the impact of a paint or of a, and of course there's groups like Ecoceno in Montreal who are doing a circular
Mm-hmm.
economy, and there are projects like that. But I think comprehensive tools that allow an artist to have a real 360 view of the impact of their practice, I think that's the way of the future, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we will want to know those things. And then, for instance, travel is an issue for any artist who does touring, you know. And then how do you
Mm-hmm.
know if your trip is worthwhile? You have to decide yourself if you want to do the trip, and then you have to convince a funder. And the funders, I used to work at Canada Council. I know they're
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how to measure those things and how to have an ethical approach to the use of any given resource.
Mm-hmm.
Including human resources and the ethics of human, and so all of those things I think have come about now with an increased level of awareness, but with a lack of tools. So I'm glad
Mm-hmm.
that you and your colleagues are working on practical tools so to help artists make better decisions, and then eventually I think it'll become second nature to really think about specifically what you're doing and what impact it has on all kinds of different.
Yeah, one of the things that actually then it might be heartening to hear is that there are a number of different tools in different contexts based off of what I sort of refer to as the permeable institution, the ability for a system, like a structure in which we're creating something, oftentimes like actual official organizational structures. Um, the ability for those to decide which tool to use and what works within their context, because they're based off of funding and based off of um, different cultural structures. Some might not be useful or might not be incentivized or the right thing to start with, but there's plenty of work being done around creating things that do fit within specific contexts, that allow people to start making changes in what they're doing. And right now, the conversation is just starting up with like, okay, how do we coordinate all these together? So there's a bit of a decision tree around which of these processes should I be actually approaching. The Julie's bicycle tools get referred to a lot, but without there is a capacity question around using them, of whether or not someone can collect the data that needs to come into it. The way that it's solved in many places is by tying it into the reporting structures around funding. So they're actually really hard to implement in a place like the United States, where there's not necessarily like a large enough funder who's committed to them to mandate something along those lines. But there's still plenty of people doing things and creating resources that are around best practices, and different ways of measuring or doing things that aren't necessarily consuming that capacity, that resource, the human resource that goes into it. And so right now the work is climate change is a global issue. Everybody's sort of working on tools that work within their context and could be useful in other contexts. How do we get somebody to be able to decide and not get overwhelmed with the flood of information that comes into having all of those different options?
Right now, I'd like to talk a bit more about the role of the arts in and around issues like climate change,
Mm-hmm.
because I know you've been teaching it literally to young people and been involved as a practitioner. What are your thoughts on? I mean, there's an obvious role that could happen, but what are some of the barriers, or what are some of the opportunities that artists could get more involved in to have a greater impact in and around the ecological crisis?
Yeah, I and I've sort of put the two main sources of limitation, it sort of snuck them into a couple of the early responses, but the two main barriers are sort of put into two categories. One is that it's going to change the way that you work, and that as an artist might not be something that you're interested in happening, or are. And it may also change what you're creating, and you may or may not be interested in those, and those might not be together. And there's always resistance to do that. I think that from my position within the performing arts, especially, that part of the resistance that uh, th- one of the collaborating artists in a project like that runs into is not just their own sort of mental blocks around, is this the way that I want to be working, or is there an assumed way that I've been working and I don't know that it can be done differently? But then also in collaborating with others, are they going to be um, uh, offer the permission to be able to let the process be changed in that way? And especially within an imposed scarcity within resources, including money, time, material resources, human resources, and how those are related together within our systems of production, particularly in performance and events-based presentations, that there's a real reticence to be able to make those changes with the sort of risk that it lends to the process of being able to complete a project on time. So in sort of looking at how we start to undo that reticence and that risk aversion to allowing those things to happen, a lot of we start looking at things within different contexts. I teach it from sort of two different directions. One is from more of a change management perspective. It's looking much more at a broader survey of how we might approach sustainability through the arts in a number of different contexts, whether or not we're coming from, ranging from our practice as artists who might also be activists, over to facilities, over to communications, and all of those structures sort of in between. There are inroads into having these discussions in each place that might, but ultimately the main thing that allows us to change what we're doing is to be able to first have an agreed like set of values that we have within whatever system that is. And so agreeing that we value biodiversity, we value a livable planet, we value clean air, etc., that we can articulate those, and that we can articulate those values through the work that we're making as well, that there is art that we're supporting that are things that programmatically express those values as well. The sort of next sort of stages in coming up with that is articulating those values within being able to reflect upon the systems in which we work, and looking for how those relationships are built, and how we can see and position anything that we might like to change or improve within a larger framework. I think this is particularly important within the arts because especially in our funding models in North America and in Europe, that there is a separation of the arts. I don't remember if it came up in a previous episode.
Zen teacher David Loy. The Buddhist solution to this predicament is not to get rid of the self, because there is no such thing to get rid of. The sense of self needs to be deconstructed, forgotten in meditation, and reconstructed, replacing the three poisons of greed, ill will, and delusion with generosity, loving kindness, and the wisdom that recognizes our interdependence. Just as there is no self to get rid of, we cannot return to nature, because we've never been apart from it. But we can realize our non-duality with it, and begin to live in ways that accord with that realization.
But the separation of the artist from the person and articulating as a profession is a unique thing. Whereas there might be an alternative to that could just be that we are expressive and artistic beings. And so we seek to create and have different talents, but turning that into a profession is something that we've done to ourselves. And so while we do that, we exist within systems. Our cultural organizations exist within systems that have impacts much farther outside of it. So that systems analysis approach is really important. Uh, the sort of next step, if we were to put it into 4 steps, the next step in that process around just imagining what one could do to change a system with when if there were no limitations, and then it becomes about pulling it back into if we can align our values, understand the systems in which we're working, and come at it with an ambitious imagination towards how things could be different, we can then start to put it into more practical steps as how we might be able to get uh, change to happen. Who are the stakeholders involved within a process that need to be part of that? What are the reasonable timelines and resources that are available to us that would allow us to work towards that change? And how can we work with time? The other way in which I also teach it is around taking a consideration as an artist through a number of different lenses that seek to problematize our standard ways of working and assumptions, which are about sort of expanding farther into some of those values of working with like social systems around the communities in which we work, looking at the way that we might consider a foundation of indigenous ways of knowing and collaborations that problematize the way that we work in our colonial settler cultural systems of working, the way that we might look at technology and how it's distributed of ways that might help us, the way that we work with not or consider the non-human as a collaborator in the work that we're doing, things that within a lot of our standard modes of creation are not necessarily brought to the forefront of sort of like expanding the lens as to what our points of collaboration within our systems and of making and understanding are, and how then they would guide our creative decision making process. If I can offer like a particular example, not of my work, but of a colleague in the field, one of a great example of that sort of like that problematizing things towards ways that we're not used to working is the Only Animals 1,000 Year Theater Project, which looks to cultivate um, uh, 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 a natural space for like a garden as a controlled vegetation area towards a bioremediative process of a performance that would take place 1,000 years from now. What are the things that you have to do now to set those things up? And that sort of scenographic idea of designing space for performance outside of human limitations of imagination is a big part of this sort of what I would term what I wouldn't term it, but what I would borrow the term from my colleague Tanya Beer as ecoscenography, and sort of taking those two different approaches, one more systematic around problematizing our ways of making, and one more problematizing what we're making, is sort of like the core of how I attempt to.
Yeah, and of course, these things are interconnected, and maybe that's the point. Also, is that everything is interconnected. I think when you were talking about the separateness of the artist, it might have been David Loy, who was a Zen teacher, talking about non-duality, and so that's a real challenge for artists to wrap their heads around, right? Because what do you mean? I'm not a professional. That's not what we're saying. It's saying there's a division. There's an artificial division between the you that is the artist and the you that is the human being, and maybe you want want to think about that and maybe heal it a bit, or at least acknowledge that there could be a divide. And so those are the kind of things I've had the privilege of hearing from many different practitioners. But in your case, you bring the digital a level of digital literacy that I'm really interested in, because you've worked with sophisticated digital technologies, and you've also done the sort of impact measurement of their use. Where does the ecological side of technology fit in the arts in particular? Because we're quite excited now that we don't travel so much anymore, and as less excited in the sense that we feel like we're reducing our footprint, and yet the footprint of technology is as large, with the servers constantly running and all around the world. So what are some of the things that we should know about as users of technology and as artists to be as ecological as possible?
A couple of things. So the first thing is just to recognize also that we can't exist without having an impact. Like, we are not impactless regardless of what we do. And there's a couple of different ways of considering that fact. One is to provide ourselves a little forgiveness that we work within systems. Like, we are within the world, we are within society that travels in certain ways, that communicates in certain ways, and that for us to, if our goal is to work on moving society towards a more sustainable future, it does require participating in those systems to some degree, but to do it conscientiously, right? So I don't think that we'll ever get away completely from travel or from electronic communications, which uh, are trickier because it is a bit more obvious that there is fuel being consumed when you are physically being moved from one location to another, especially if that involves keeping something up in the air. It's very energy intensive to keep things to defy gravity uh, and to work that way. And so a lot of our electronics, there's an assumption that we make that moving something over to an electronic medium would be less impactful for what we're doing. Now, in terms of the ability to do work in two places, and this sort of delves into a little bit of the media theoretical side of things, we're going to get a little into sort of like the McLuhan end of things, which I think is probably appropriate nationally. But this idea that we have the ability, right now you and I are in two different places. I'm coming from Toronto, and connected in my home, and we are having an immediate communication in something that in another time would require us to move from place to place, and far enough, would not be something that could be recorded, etc. So there is a reduction in the amount of energy and effort that needs to go into us having this discarnate experience where we're able to do work. You're able to do work in the place that I'm in, and I'm able to do work through extending our eyes and ears through these electronic communications. And those are less energy intensive than actually moving our entire body from place to place. And ultimately, that turns into emissions and environmental impact because that energy needs to come from someplace. There is a point in time where perhaps we would walk to each other, and we would take a certain amount of time, and that would be based off of the amount of food that we consumed and that. But in terms of any of our contemporary ways of moving, there is either electricity or fuel that needs to be consumed from place to place in there is a huge difference between our options there, and we've sort of been encouraged to not think about them. It's not necessarily economically beneficial to those who are trying to sell us those goods and services for us to be too aware of those things, so that we're comparing there's the illusion of choice when we choose like what route that we're taking or which airline we're flying, when the actual choice is between the modes of transportation, the modes of communication. One of the things that's interesting is you were at have been part of the Green Rooms project that concluded last June. And originally, the culminating event for that, in an effort to save long distance travel, was moved to 8 different locations so that people could reduce their long haul travel for that. And because of COVID, it was all moved online as well. So what was exciting about that was that we had an opportunity, actually, because we had developed 3 models for participation, to actually say that if we had the same participants coming from the same places, what would the energy impact for that look like? And it's a significant reduction to move it electronically, though it is not without any impact at all. And this has been a consideration, in music distribution. We've moved from physical media, from just in the last 20 years, from compact discs to downloads to streaming music. And that has changed the carbon footprint from the material resources that go into the creation of the physical media and moving those around into downloads, which have the energy required to pull something down from one server to another, to the streaming, which is a constant flow of information.
Well, we won't be able to talk about all of them today. We're getting near the end of our conversation, at least this one.
Right.
We'll have more. I'm glad you raised the National Arts Centre project, because there is a report that you and some of your colleagues worked on the impact of the green rooms, and that's an example. So I'll put that in the episode notes. And of course, I encourage people to go to the different websites that you are working on, including the Creative Green Tools, which we'll talk about later when they become available for users. But Ian, Garrett, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to say? Because there's still a bit of time. I mean, anything we haven't touched upon?
I find myself falling into this trap so often these days that oftentimes when that my efforts in trying to uh, talk about this subject with especially new colleagues, is that it becomes a huge brain dump of information, of saying like, well, these things are connected and these events are coming together. Well, one of the things that, because we're talking about reality and grief, and there was a moment that I had of reality at the summit that was in Banff in person. It was I was talking to Alison Tickell from Julie's Bicycle at the time, and both of us sort of feeling as regardless of wherever else we were, but within this movement, quote unquote movement, feeling like the elder statesman. We had been involved in ecological arts and sustainable practice for decades at that point. And both of us sort of shared this common experience that there was a bit of feeling like we were losing a bit of touch with everything that was going on. Like, we were presented with so much information. There's so many new people who were interested in things. I mean, one of the nice things about that convening was, though it was actually relatively small, and there's some issues and some things to unpack about it, like the scale of that event, of having that summit together, and its curation, and just in the fact that it's curated, but it was still more people oftentimes in sort of decision making positions than are oftentimes brought together in a room together to have a conversation about this specific topic. And it helped both of us sort of realize, we were having this conversation about, like, there's all these things happening. I feel like I keep going back to the same examples for things. I feel like I'm losing touch with things that are happening. And I think that, and maybe this is the eternal optimist in me, which is sort of like a necessity out of like continuing to do this work, is that I just couldn't hold it in my head anymore. The number of people who had been engaged with things had expanded beyond my ability to like have an internal idea of like, here's who knows about this and here's who knows about this and here's who you go to who's leading this, because we're just trying to convince people to do things. And there's so much more activity that had built up its own momentum, that it was actually it went from a feeling of, are we just losing control, or things going off the rails, to no, things are going in a positive direction.
Well, I've experienced the same thing myself with this podcast. The more people I talk to, the more it unfolds, and you realize that people are working in diverse ways, and some of them under the radar, but they need to be their work needs to be amplified, right?
Yeah. At this point in season 2, if I can ask you a question,
Sure.
Having started with this question of reality,
Mm-hmm.
and coming to grips with that, and grief, as you've been having these conversations, how has your perception of that reality and grief altered over time?
Well, that's a good question, and I will give a more fulsome answer in the summary episode that I'm going to do in a few weeks once I've finished recording. And over the summer, I'm going to pull together the knowledge, and there's some very, very interesting things. David, I'm going to forget his last name right now, but a British eco artist, really kind of shocked me, and he said, "Well, reality is what is culture."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, right, of course. And these are things I sort of knew, but oh yes, of course, it's the culture that you live in, that and your values and your beliefs. That's your reality. There is physical reality, of course. There's tangible things, but in your mind, you create your own reality. So, without getting too much into it, I appreciate the question, because it's the premise of the whole season is why did I ask that question? Well, the reason is because I was living it myself. I was feeling that accepting reality was necessary for me to move on into a more active, engaged. I had to kind of deal with that, the fact that it's so bad that if I don't actually accept that, it's especially the baked in things that we can't change, I can't function. And just today, today is May 25th. I had a really bad, dark day. I was, crying inside my head about how bad things are and just losing hope. And then I read this beautiful piece by Rebecca Solnit, who was saying, there's some hope out there, because the combination of all these efforts, you have been doing a lot, but when you combine that with so many, like millions and millions of people around the world who are making a difference, it will come together, and there will be a tipping point towards some kind of not just awakening, but action, collective action. That's where we need to go, and that's where we are going. In terms of the ecological grief, I'm still working on it. It's a tough one, because when you talk to ecological grief experts, they say, well, talk about it, blah, blah, blah. But the field is just starting to develop now, and I'm part of a group of grief educators about climate. And there's some women, Krista Heiser, who I interviewed recently, who talked a lot about that. And so I've been listening. I've been listening to the experts and trying to figure out my own approach to as a communicator, what do I think people need to know, and that's the people I choose to bring into the podcast conversations, but also the way I'll tie it together. I'm hoping that last episode will tie together a lot of loose ends that are to me important. They're important to me, and I hope they'll be important to others sort of like me, artists, cultural workers, who are more than interested in the issue, who are traumatized by the issue. It's like that's the thing. You've been in it for a while, so like you say, you've kind of found a way to work through it, but it probably still hits you as well. How, you have young children, right? What kind of world are we leaving to our children? Dharma teacher Catherine Ingram. Love. What else is there to do now? Here we are, some of the last humans who will experience this beautiful planet since Homo sapiens began their journey some 200,000 years ago. Now, in facing extinction of our species, you may wonder if there's any point in going on.
Yeah. I still chose to, in doing this work, sometimes I think about that I did still choose to have children. And I think that it's important. I think that there is we live in a relatively wealthy nation with relatively calm and a relatively calm reality um, that others don't get to enjoy. So I know that in some ways I'm very insulated from it. But it is still knowing the things that I know, I still like it's still a choice to have children because I think there, I think that I don't want to confuse the end of an ecologically unsustainable, untenable way of civilization working in this moment with a complete guarantee of extinction. There is a future. It may look very different. And sometimes I think the inability to see exactly what that future is or plan for it can be confused for there not being one. And I'm sort of okay with that uncertainty. And in the meantime, all one can really do is the work to try and make that, whatever it ends up being, more positive. There's a sense of biophilia about it and decentering of the human. Whether that's going to actually look like donut economics or that's a tool for getting us there. That all of these different tools and the coordination around them is going to get us someplace.
And I think, regeneration, ancient cultures who learned how to live in more simple ways. This is why the dichotomy of sophisticated technology and more simple lifestyle is not necessarily incompatible, right? You can develop tools in responsible ways and say these are great tools for humanity, for monitoring wildlife. There's lots of good things to them. Let's just see the full picture. I guess that's what I want, is to see, hear, feel in particular the full picture, so that I as a privileged person can take advantage of the resources around me to share the knowledge that I think is useful and to listen. So many, you asked, so many people talked about listening. Hildegard Westerkamp in an early episode said it's all about slowing down and listening, which is counterintuitive to the panic of the climate emergency. Siona Seth Klein is saying we need to activate. Yes, we do. But somehow to activate, we have to slow down a little bit, figure out who we are, how the dots connect, how we can work together and really work together, as you've said, in ways that are, in a way, unthinkable, and yet we've done it before, right? We've overcome many challenges, and so I like the way you position it, because that's realistic optimism, what you said there. And maybe that's the thing, right?
That's what I go for. That's where I pay. That's where it's based. It's interesting because I think that I think about this a lot, especially now, a couple decades in. Is that I agree with the activation, but I agree with the activation as like it's never too late to get started. But not knowing what the ending is, like we don't that like we have to allow for the time for us to do it. And many of us might not make it along the entire journey, but it's great to be active and get activated to start, but that's just starting. That's not completion.
Well, it's an ongoing process. I mean, you do what you can with the life that you have, and I think we'll leave it at that, Ian, because we've gone on for a good 50 minutes. So this is a record setting. This is the longest episode ever, and I appreciate it, because I knew you had a lot to say from different angles, and you have much more to say. But as a teacher and as a researcher, it's really interesting to hear how your thinking has sort of gelled over the years, and so I appreciate the conversation very much.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.